It's just starting up. Okay, yeah. So as I was saying, an API basically provides you with an interface, an easy a medium to communicate with other languages and other type of projects that are not compatible with your project or your language. Okay, so it is used to refer to many different things. In case of Android phones, there are many native APIs that are written in their native machine code, but you can talk to these different sensors using their specific APIs when you're making an Android application. Even in case of your laptops or your desktops, there are many different APIs. Like for if you want to get the location, then you have the location API. If you want to get the data from the camera or microphone, you have different APIs for those as well, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are not like the logic behind using a camera is not written in JavaScript, right? It is written in some machine code that is run on the system where your project is running, basically. But you can talk to them using their specific APIs, which are basically written in the language that you're using, right? Which is JavaScript in our case. So APIs are also used to refer to like backends that give you some kind of data. So obviously these backends can be written in any other language. It can be in Python, Go. There's Elixir. There's Node.js as well, which is like JavaScript only. But you talk to them through one single type of API, right? So that's what APIs are. So let's start with working with the let's start with delving into the API that we are going to use. So I'll just search for OpenWeather, and this is the website for the for the API that we're going to use. I'll just put it in the chat box as well. Okay. So if you go to the homepage of this, you might remember that we already saw this like website in the last session at the very end. So it gives you an example of what all is possible with this API. So there's time series data, and there's the next 8-day forecast. There's different kinds of data like the min max temperature. There's also a status icon, and there's wind speed, humidity, and many more data pointers that data points that you get from this API, that you can get from this API. So I've chosen this API obviously because it offers a very generous free tier. Like obviously there's public APIs, and then there are APIs that you make on your own, like backend projects that you make on your own, right? So public APIs are hosted by some other people or some other company, and they have to pay some kind of hosting fee in order to keep it online, and in order to keep it up up all the time, right? So that is why they have different tiers for if you're using their APIs extensively. But since this is a personal project that we are making, so we can use the free tier. And you can see that the free tier offers you a lot of API calls, like a very big amount of API calls, and even the frequency of these API calls is like really generous. So you get 60 calls per minute. That is like one API call per second. And I don't think like a person can make more than one call in 1 second. So this is fine. Okay. And the things that it offers under the free tier is also very generous. So you can get the current weather, the like minute forecast for the last 1 hour, hourly forecast for the last 2 days, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be focusing only on the current weather. Okay. And then you can get weather maps data. We're not going to use this one. But then you have more APIs. Like for air pollution there is a separate API, and for geocoding there is an API. So geocoding, when we get into the documentation for this API, you'll know that geocoding is basically to find the longitudes and latitudes based on the location name that we provide. So this API enables you to do that basically. Okay, so we'll get into each of these parts one by one. But first, I'll just click on the API section now. So every public API definitely has a documentation out there, okay? Because people would need to know how to use your API, right? So if you are working on a backend project and you want to make its API public, then you will also have to provide a documentation to people on how to use it, because it's not just you who's going to use this API. So you have to provide an extensive documentation. So we'll start by getting the current weather for, as I said, in my case, I'll use Chennai because that's the city I'm currently in. So we can click on the API doc button over here. and it tells you like what all formats are supported by this API, like what all formats you can get from this API. Then it tells you like what all tiers are available and what all data it provides. So I'll just click on API doc now, and we'll see that so the first thing that we see is how like by what things we can call this particular API, like what all can it use to get the weather data to us. Okay, so the first thing is that it can get you the weather data based on the city name. Okay, let's see like what we would need to use. Okay, so there's city name. By city name you can get the weather data. Then there's city ID. So you can make an API call by city ID. List of city ID is present on this website basically, and it can be downloaded. And like you can check what is the ID for your particular city. Okay, we are basically trying to search for the most convenient way to get the weather data. Okay, there's geographic coordinates, and there's also zip code. So you can look at each, you can look that you can see that each of these API, like each of these different examples has a specific URL to call the API, or more precisely URI. Okay, so URI stands for Uniform Resource Indicator. So each of these will basically return you a resource that will specify the current weather for this longitude or latitude, or for a city ID, or for a particular city name, or for a zip code. But you might notice that there is one thing that remains common in all of these, is that it's asking for an API key, right? So there's even in zip code, in geographic locations, in city ID, everywhere you have this API key. So what is an API key? So as I said earlier, like public APIs are used by many different people, right? And the company behind Open Weather need to keep track of which person or which organization is using their API at what frequency, or how often they are using it, and how they are using it. So that is what the API key is for. The API key is basically specifying which user is using this particular API. Okay, so this is something that you keep hidden from other people. Like you don't show it to you don't show it to other people. You don't push it to your GitHub repositories, because you don't want other people to steal your API key. Because if you're paying for your API, then your API key is something that is valuable to you. Okay, and people might exploit it. So API key, that's what API keys are, and this is mostly only specific to public APIs. Okay, so we can start by first signing into this to this website, and that will give us our own API key. So I'll start by signing in. You guys can follow along as well. I'll hit create account, and I'll create an account. All right. So let's see what is it giving me. So I don't want to get any kind of communications from Open Weather, so I'll just hit create account. So it's asking me for a purpose and company. So company, I'll just write my own name, and purpose is, okay, let's see what we can do. So I'll just choose education and hit save. And once you do it, you can go into your My API Keys section, and you'll see that they give you they give you a default API key. So you can just copy it, and this is the API key. In my case, your API key might differ. And if at any point accidentally you reveal your API key, so most of these public API websites allow you to generate a new API key as well. Okay, so and delete the original one. So I've copied my API key. So how you manage these, how do you manage these valuable credentials in your project? So the way to do it is by creating a .env file. In case of a React application, this is very specific to React applications only, the way that I'm doing it. But even for backend applications and Node.js, you do a very similar thing, except that the name of those variables can be are more flexible than in case of React applications. Okay, so I'll just go to the React documentation, and as I said, like the best resource for learning React is React's own documentation. So I'll search React doc environment variables. And so there's a specific section dedicated to how you create these variables. So environment variables are basically variables that you want to keep hidden from like you want to keep separated from your project, but are needed in your projects. Okay. So when you're developing your project, then you use such a similar file like .env, but you don't push it to your GitHub. So like if you can see, currently it's being highlighted normally, right, this file. So I'll just add it to git ignore, and this will ignore this file from the git version control system. So now it's grayed out. So whenever you push or commit these changes, the env file won't be going through. Okay. So the way you define environment variables is by like starting with a variable name like react underscore app underscore and then the variable name. Okay. So that's what I'm going to use here. And this is basically written in any file that ends with a .env. Okay. So it's saying by default you will have a node env defined for you and any other environment variable starting with react app. Okay. Okay, let's see that it works or not. So as it's saying, like you can use the .env file and create and put it at the root of your project. That's what I've done here. And then you can define environment variables in this fashion, starting with React app. Okay. So I'll call it open weather API. You can name it anything you wish, but this is what I'm naming it. And I'll paste the API key that I got and hit save. So this is basically the whole environment variable that you're going to use for throughout your application. And then you can refer to this environment variable anywhere in your application by writing. So I'll just do it in app.js to show you. So if I write console.log and then process.env dot this thing, so it will give me this particular environment variable. Okay. So so you can get more environment variables out of this process.env as and when you define them over here. But this is the environment variable that we need. This is all the environment variables. So if I go to console now, okay, it's coming undefined because every time you change this .env file, you need to restart your application. So I'll just do that now. Hit yarn start. So now if I go to inspect element, you'll see that this API key is being logged. There are many different, warnings as well. So you can remove them because most of the time such warnings are or like like React automatically suggests you what's the proper exchange for this particular attribute name. So you can do that, but I'm just gonna ignore them for now. Okay. Or maybe we should remove it because it's just giving us extra noise. So let's just do that. So everywhere where I'm using stroke line cap, I need to use stroke and line cap in camel case. So I'm using the search all feature to replace all of like all the errors. Then for stroke width as well, we need to use stroke width in camel case. And similarly for stroke line join. These are all attributes that were used in the SVG icons. And after this, fill rule. The rule. Okay, and tip rule. All right, and fill opacity. And class as well, because somewhere I'm missing it. There should be class name. And no, I cannot do this because like it will actually replace everywhere where class is written. So let's just see where all it's actually written as class name right now. So I think it's the first place where it's present is in the header. So yeah, so these can be replaced with class name. And similarly in the start section as well. So somewhere around here, yeah, right here. So now, there won't be any more warnings if I clear it and hit refresh. Yeah, so there's just the log that we added in the app.jsx. Okay. So now once I have this API, I can start like using it throughout our applications. Okay. So I'll go back to the section that we were at the current weather data. And so before adding the APIs to your actual projects and directly testing like what the API is giving you, we can test the API by actually putting this in an application that's called Postman. So Postman is a application that you can install on a system, and it allows you to explore APIs and basically make API requests to different endpoints. So these URLs that we are copying are also referred to as endpoints. So it allows you to test APIs without actually like sending them through a browser. Okay. So here, like I've pasted the API syntax for searching through city name, getting the weather data through city name, and it also has different variants which you can also use. So you can search via city name, state, and country code as well. But I'm just gonna do it by city name and see what it returns. Okay. So instead of using this, I'll write Chennai, and at the place of API key, I'll paste the API key that I copied. Okay. And I'll change it to get request because I think this would be a get request. So basically there are different request methods for APIs, and most probably this is a get request, and it must be written somewhere as well that it is a get request. So it's also giving us an example for how it's used. So we are using it correctly now. And then once you are happy with your URI, you can just hit send, and you'll get a response. In our case, we are getting an invalid API key error. So this means that my API key that I copied might be wrong. So let's just see what's wrong with the thing that I copied. So it's saying the API key is wrong, right? Let's see if it is wrong or not. API key, please see this one. Okay, so the reason what it was showing that is because this API key is not yet created. So like this is basically the default API key, and I guess we can't use it. So I'll just try by creating a new API key. So I'll call it weather lens, which is the name that I gave to the project. So it basically created a new API key for me. So I'll copy this and paste it here and try again. And it's giving me invalid API key again. So let's just see what's wrong with our, let's just see what might be going wrong here. So the error that we are getting is 401, right? So I'll just open this up and see you did not specify an API key. Your API key is not activated yet. Within the next couple of hours, it will be activated and ready to use. Okay, you're using a wrong API key in API request. Please check your Okay, so I think it's most probably this thing, that my API key is not yet activated, and it might take a few hours to get activated, and that's a bummer. So yeah,
I created an account a few months back.
okay.
Send mine.
Yeah, sure. Can you send it? I'll just try it out.
Please, I'll send it over.
Okay, sure.
Yes, I'll send it.
Yeah, let me check my WhatsApp. Okay, let's test this out. So yeah, that was the error. Like the API key that I was using was not yet activated, so it might take a while for your API key to activate as well. So like for now, what we can do is like we can depend on us, like we can write this whole API request and just use this API key. Kunal, are you fine with that if I share this API
Yeah.
key to other people for
Yes,
now?
man. Yes, man. Sure.
Okay. Okay, sure. So I'm adding this API key in the Google Meet chat, and if you guys are following along, you can use this API key instead. And later on, when you're actually like when your API key is activated, you can swap this out for your own. So let's now look at the response that we are getting from the request that we made. So we basically sent the request for getting the weather data for Chennai, right? And this is the response that we are getting. So the first thing that we are getting is the longitude and latitude for Chennai. Then we are getting the weather details, like in a like it's basically the current weather details. So it's saying that the weather here is misty, and it's giving me an icon, but it's in the form of a string. But we'll look into this later on. Okay. The next thing that it's giving me is all the major details. So the temperature, what it feels like exactly, then the minimum temperature, the maximum temperature, the pressure, and the humidity. But these units seem to be messed up. So let's just see what units it uses by default. So if I go back to the documentation section, it will tell me the units that we're using. So instead of going through this whole thing, I'll just search for units, and let's just see what all units it takes. Okay, so here it says units of measurement, standard, metric, and imperial units are available. If you do not use the units parameter, standard units will be applied by default. So I suppose that these units are in terms of Kelvin. So if I want them to be degree Celsius or Fahrenheit, I can head over to this section of the documentation, and I'll see that I can specify what units I want. So instead of standard, I'll use metric here. Okay. So I'll go back here and add another parameter. So the way you add parameter is putting an ampersand symbol, then adding the new parameter name, putting an equal to, and adding the value. So if I send this now, you'll see that the units now are degree Celsius, because yeah, these are more realistic in terms of degree Celsius. And if I change this to imperial, I'll get them in Fahrenheit. So these values are now in Fahrenheit. All right. So for now, I'll just change this back to metric and copy this. So this is the final API URL that we are going to use for Chennai, specific to Chennai. And I'll just close Postman for now because I don't need it anymore. And let's just see how we can send the same API request through inside our React application. Okay. So in order to send API requests using JavaScript, in case of browser or in case of Node.js as well, we have a function that is called fetch. So this function is not defined by you, it is defined by the browser itself. So whenever you write this fetch method anywhere, you'll be able to send a API call or a network request to any kind of URL you wish. Okay. So but I cannot do this like exactly here just like that, because we talked about like how React handles renders, right? So every time a particular component is rendered or re-rendered, it's basically calling the function for that component. So whenever page container is being rendered, not exactly page container, let's just talk about sidebar for now. So whenever sidebar is being re-rendered, so it's basically calling this whole function, and whatever is being returned, that is what page container is, that is what sidebar is rendering, right? So it's basically calling that function. So if we write the fetch request directly inside app, so whenever the app is re-rendering, the whole app is re-rendering, then each of those times fetch will be called again and again, and new data would be taken again and again. So this would do two things. First, it would waste your API calls that you have, the limit of monthly API calls of whatever the value was. And the second thing is that it will randomly update anytime whenever the app is being re-rendered. And we don't want that, because that is not something that you want. You want the API calls to be more controlled and to happen only when you want them to happen, right? So for that, we need to figure out some other way to do these. So here I'm going to introduce the next React hook. The first hook that we discussed was use state. Here we are going to discuss the next React hook that is most commonly used, which is the use effect hook. Okay, so it's also, first of all, you need to import it. So it's also imported from React, and the thing that we need to import is use effect. Okay, so let's just look at the documentation and what it tells about this hook. So accepts a function that contains imperative, possibly effectful code. This doesn't tell us much about what use effect does, so we'll head on to the documentation for it. And like if you read through it, it'll basically tell you that use effect is used to fire side effects. Okay, so what do I mean by this? So I'll just close this down and I'll tell you what use effect is. So what use effect is basically run every after the whole component is rendered or re-rendered, and you can put checks on different variables, that what variable actually triggered that render. So for example, if I want to run a side effect whenever the location on my the location variable on my application changes, so in that case I can specify that I want to run a particular effect whenever the location variable changes via use effect. And the way we do it is, so I write use effect and then put a set of curly braces, because that's how we use hooks, right? Then the first thing that it accepts is the effect callback, right? The effect callback is actually a function that is run, that is the side effect that happens when the location changes. Okay, so how do you define that? When should this use effect run? So for that only, it takes another argument. Okay, the first argument is this function, and the second argument that it takes is an array, and it's more precisely called a dependency array. So if you look at here, it says that it's a dependency list. Okay, so it accepts a dependency array to keep a watch on, and whenever anything inside this dependency array changes, then this function is executed. Okay, so if I write location, and location is a state variable, or maybe a global state variable, then in that case, whenever the location changes, this function would run. Okay, but for now, we don't want the API call to run whenever something changes or something happens. We want the API call to run only the first time when the page is loaded. So basically, the first time when the this particular component, the app component, is rendered. Okay, so for that we leave this empty, like the whole dependency array is empty. So this use effect function will only happen once at the very start. Okay, so inside here, I'll first of all write effect fired, and when I go over here, you'll see that effect is fired. But even if I change things, if I change this state, for example, so this particular state is being re-rendered, but the whole app is not being re-rendered, right? So that's why this effect is not firing again and again. Okay, and also because there is nothing in the dependency array, so even if the whole app is re-rendered, this effect will not fire. But if I hit refresh, it will fire for the first time. So this is what we need, and here is where we can write the API call itself. Okay, so as I was saying, to send a request to any endpoint, we use the fetch function, right? So I'll write fetch and put curly braces. So it's not giving me any documentation here, so I'll just head over to Google and search for fetch documentation. And the best resource again is MDN. So I'll just go here, and it tells you that the Fetch API provides an interface for fetching resources, including across the network. It will seem familiar to anyone who has used this particular request. So I'll tell you about this thing. So HTML, XML HTTP request is basically the predecessor of Fetch API. Okay, again, fetch is also an API. So it's basically a predecessor of XML. It's basically a successor of XML HTTP request. Okay, so this was the method that was used earlier to write API calls and HTTP calls. But now fetch API is being used in modern browsers, so we are going to use that. Okay, so you will also see examples underneath on how to use fetch. So somewhere around here, you'll see the example. Yeah, using fetch. So here you'll see how fetch is used. So I'll just copy this and then I'll try to explain it. Okay, so I'll paste it here, and so the first parameter that fetch accepts is the endpoint or the URL which it needs to fetch data from, right? So I'll just paste our API string here. This is the this is the API that we need to call, and I'll also write https:// at the very first, okay, and I'll also test it once if it's working or not. So if I open this on my Chrome, so I'm getting the whole response over here as well. So yeah, it's working properly. So the first thing that it requires is basically the whole string, and it also has multiple different options apart from this, but we are not going to delve into that right now. So once the data has been fetched, what do you need to do with this? So this is called this is basically called a promise. So the fetch API actually returns you a promise type of data. Okay. So promise is a data type in JavaScript, which is used to, work with data that doesn't come instantly to you. It takes a while for this data to be processed and to be returned to you. So those kind of data is basically called a promise. So how do you write code for something that is happening at a later point of time and not instantly? So for that only we have this particular way of writing code. This is basically called this is basically part of asynchronous JavaScript. So what we are doing is we are specifying that whenever this whole thing happens and whenever we actually get the response, so then only we need to do these set of steps that follow. Okay. So that is why that is what a promise means as well. So a promise is basically that JavaScript is promising you that it will get you the response at a later point of time. It's not available yet, but it promises that yeah, you'll get the response, or the response might fail at a later point of time. So then you can handle this success or failure using then, and for failure you can use .catch. Okay. So for now I'll just use .then and see what response we are getting. So the response that we get from a fetch API, if I remove this particular then here and I remove this response.json and I write console.log response. Okay. So the if I just save it with just this much code, I'll be able to get the whole response over here. Okay. But as you can see, this response contains a lot of stuff that we don't want to see. What we actually need is this whole body, right? And it's in terms of a it's in terms of a format that is not directly readable. It's in terms of a stream. Okay. Because it is basically a stream of bytes that is coming to your computer. Okay. So we need to convert this to a format that is easily readable for us and for our application as well. So for that only we are using response.json. Okay. So this basically converts the whole response to a JSON, and this also returns you a promise. Okay. As you can see here, it is telling you that it returns you a promise. Okay. And it also tells you here the callback to execute when the promise is resolved. Okay. So it is returning you a promise, and then the promise that is being returned from response.json can be handled in another then block, and in here we'll get the actual JSON. Okay. So I can console.log it here like this. Okay. Also, I'll tell you about this arrow function. So as you can see, I've not added curly braces over here, right? So this kind of arrow function is used when you only need to return a very simple type of data. So here I wanted to return from this particular then block, I wanted to return like the JSON promise, right? So that is why I directly wrote it. If I happen to use curly braces over here like this, then I had to write the return keyword at the very start. So if your arrow function looks something like this and doesn't have any other business logic over here, then in that case you can remove the curly braces and remove the return keyword as well, to make it look a little cleaner. Okay. That's why that's why this works, and that's why I've written it like this. So basically this then function is returning response.json, and then this function is calling this console log and also returning something, but we are not doing anything with that return. Okay. So here now if you look at it, so you'll get the actual response that we were seeing in Postman earlier. Okay. So this is the whole response with all of the data that we needed. All right. But there is a potential flaw with this. So as I said, Fetch API is a modern API for XML HTTP requests, right? That means it might not be supported in many browsers. So if I search can I use.com and I search for Fetch, so I can see that it doesn't work on Internet Explorer and also on Opera Mini and many other many earlier versions of Android browser as well. But API calling is something that is essential to our application, right? So if the API call itself doesn't work, then it's a very big issue for our application, and we don't want that. So how do we handle this? So like I can give you an example of that it really doesn't work on Internet Explorer. So I'll just open browser stack for this. And because Windows 11 doesn't have Internet Explorer, that's why I need to do this. And I'll run a I'll run a Internet Explorer version 11 on Windows 10. And I'll write this same fetch call inside a console. So by now you must know that the inspect element console can also run JavaScript, right? So I can do any kind of console logs and stuff from here. So if I write a simple console.log and hey, so this would be logged to the console. So similarly, I can also run this whole complex fetch call here, and I'll paste it here and hit enter. And okay, so so since this is multi-line, I need to click this button to run it. So if I once I do this, so it's basically saying me like it's giving me a syntax error over here, right? But if I remove these lines, like if I remove the then chains and all, so now if I run it, it's saying fetch is undefined. So it basically means that Internet Explorer is not recognizing fetch, and this is a very like fatal for our application, because then our application will be completely dead. So we don't want that, and that is why we use something called polyfills for features that are not supported by certain browsers. There are libraries that polyfill, that basically fill these gaps by using earlier versions or earlier implementations of the same features that are available in modern browsers. So in case of Internet Explorer, we would want to switch fetch with XML HTTP request. So, but we don't want to handle that on our own, and writing a XML HTTP request is like very tedious. So that is why we use a library for API calls that is called Axios. Okay. So Axios is a promise-based HTTP client for browser. If I go to npm, you'll see an example somewhere around here for how Axios is used. So first we import Axios, and then we can simply make a get request by using axios.get and then the URL, and then rest everything is similar to how fetch is used. So we can write a then and a catch block, and that can handle all the success and the errors. And so that's what we're going to do now. So I'll install Axios first of all. I'll do that by yarn add Axios. And once it's completed, we can import that into our application. So I'll import it in the app.js itself for now. I'll do import Axios from Axios and move this import to the top. So basically the way I organize my imports are, first of all comes all the libraries that I've installed, then comes all the components that I've made. So that's why Axios is over here. Then I can replace fetch with axios.get, and inside there this would be the same, and I don't need this then, because Axios automatically converts the response to a JSON value. All I need to do is console.log it. So I'll console.log the response and hit save. Then if I go back to my inspect element, I'll see all the data. So apart from the data, we also have much more stuff over here. So it's also telling me which method it used to call make this request. So behind the scenes it used XML HTTP request only, and then the headers that were sent with the request, and so on and so forth. But we are only focusing on the data. So I'll console log response of data, and I'll get the whole data. So this is much simpler than writing a fetch request, in my opinion. Okay. So and also it will work on both Internet Explorer and other modern browsers as well. So so once we are getting this data, we need to somehow instruct React to show this data in each of its component and basically update all this data in the components. So by now you must know that if you like did the attended the last session, you must know that for that we use state variables, right? So we need to define our very first actual state variable that we're going to use. So I'll just import use state over here, and I'll define a state. So this would be the state for weather data, like the whole weather data, right? So I'll just call it weather data. And if you remember, the use state function returns us two things, right? So if I write here use state, and for now I'll just leave it empty. If you remember, it returns us two things, right? First is the value, and the second thing is a function that can update this value. So the second thing, I'll call it weather data. Okay. Set weather data. Now for the default value, what can we use? So the last time when we used use state, the default value was a numeric value, because this state variable was basically to represent the index, right, for the location array. But here this would represent the whole weather data, and the weather data is in the format of a JSON. It's basically a JSON object, right? So even in the default value, I'll use an empty JSON object. Okay. So now I'll hit, now what I'll do is, when I get the response, instead of console.log, I'll use set weather data. And this will basically update this state variable with the correct weather data once it gets the response from this API call. Okay. So now I'll have all the weather data, and I can now console log it here. Okay. And you might notice now I'm writing this console log outside of the use effect, because I want to show you something. So here I'll console log the weather data and hit save and clear this whole thing. And now I'll hit refresh. So you'll see there were two logs that were generated from line number 28, where I wrote the console log. Okay. I'll zoom it a bit and I'll close this terminal. So you'll see from line number 28, we got two different logs. So this happened because there were two separate renders. The first render happened when the API call was still going through, like it wasn't yet started and it was still going through. So that was the initial page load, and at that time our weather data was completely empty. Okay. Then the API call successfully went through and we got the response, and then we updated the state. And when we did this state update, React rendered the whole thing again, and that is why we got another console log where we had the actual data. So that's why this particular statement was run twice, because this whole function, the app function, was called twice, or was re-rendered, like it was rendered again. Okay. So that's why we got two different logs. So now once I have this weather data, I can send it over to all of my components. And how do we send data to the like lower components, to the children components? We use props. So I'm going to name this prop data, just simple data, and I'll like forward all of this weather data to both the components, to my start components and to my sidebar components as well, because we are using that data everywhere in our application. Okay. I'll hit save. And let's just start with updating these data everywhere in our application. So the first thing that we want to update is in the sidebar, the temperature. So let's just go to sidebar, and there, let's scroll down, and this is where we want to use it, right? So we are getting that property, like the data prop. So I'll just extract that data prop by using object destructuring. So I'm destructuring the props object. This whole thing is the whole thing that we get here is props, right? So I'm just destructuring it and taking out the data prop from inside the props object. Okay. And I hope that makes sense. And I'll scroll down to here, and I'll replace 23 with data dot something. Now that something is inside this main object, and inside the main, it's somewhere around here. So it's main.temp. Okay. So it should be data.main.temp. All right. So I'll write main.temp and hit save. And I already know that this is gonna give me an error. So I'll just go back and I'll hit refresh, and I got an error. It's saying cannot read properties of undefined, reading temp. So it's telling me that it's trying to read temp, but it's getting undefined because the rest of the part is, and it cannot happen because the rest of the part is undefined. Okay. So why is it undefined? So you might remember that I mentioned that before the API call happens, the whole state that is holding the weather data is empty, right? So when I'm trying to get something from an empty object and it's not present there, in our case, data was empty, and inside data we are trying to get main and it was not present. That is why this whole thing is getting undefined. And the next time around, when we are trying to get something from main, and main was undefined, so undefined.temp is completely wrong, and that is why it errors out. Okay. If I remove this .temp part and I hit refresh, then it will give me objects are not valid as a React child. And basically it's giving me a different error. It's saying that the object is there, like it found an object with the whole thing. So the API call went through, and we can say that because it's being logged here. So the API call went through, there was no error, but this time around we are sending an object here, right? So it cannot show an object onto the screen. So that is why it's not working. So but what we want is that when this thing is undefined, we don't actually show data.temp.main. We don't want to show this as long as data.main is undefined. So the way we do it is by conditional rendering. Okay. So what is conditional rendering? So basically we can instruct sections, like different sections in React to show data, to show something on the screen only when a particular condition is true. Okay. So what I want is when data.main is true, then only, or more like data.main is not false, then only we want to show this. Okay. So at times data.main might be undefined, right? And so undefined in JavaScript can also be, considered as false. Same with null. So null can also be considered as a falsely value. Okay. So that is why whenever this value is undefined or false, then this temp would not be shown, and it will only show degree Celsius at first. Okay. So if I refresh this, you'll see that for a very short amount of time, it only shows degree Celsius. I can also slow this down. So if you go to your network tab and you click this throttling drop down and set it to slow 3G and hit refresh. Oh my god, this is too slow. Okay, let's just wait. So you'll see that at first you don't get the data, and then the data actually comes and you get the value here, right? Okay. That is totally fine for us. So because most of the time this is going to come really fast. So this is something that you can do, but it also looks very repetitive, right? So there's a replacement for this that is like that was added to JavaScript very recently, and it's called optional chaining. Okay. So what you can do, instead of writing it like this, you can chain it optionally. So this is basically chaining, right? You're chaining data.main.temp and so on and so forth. You can chain it infinitely, right? So there is something called optional chaining. So what you do is you can put a question mark before each of the dots, and what it does is it will only get the main value when this is defined, or when this is not undefined. Okay. And it will only get the temp value when this is defined. Okay. So this basically suppresses all of the undefined errors that we might get. So, and basically when this whole thing is undefined, when this particular part is undefined, the whole thing will automatically get undefined, and so on and so forth. Like if this is undefined, the whole thing will automatically get undefined, and it won't give you an error. It basically suppresses all those errors. Okay. So this is what optional chaining is. It will only go to the main part when the data part is defined, and it will only go to the temp part when the main part is defined. Okay. So with this, we avoid that conditional rendering syntax over here. So let's just start putting data as quickly as possible. So the next thing that I want to show is feels like. So here I'll, instead of using 22.5, I'll use data.main.feels like. Okay. And again, I'll use optional chaining. Okay, so now hopefully I'll get that data as well. All right, if I hit refresh, yeah, so that data is coming up. And I'll also stop this slow 3G thing over here. Okay, so now that data is also coming here. The next thing that I want to show is, let's see what we can show is, so do we get the time anywhere? The dt keywords seems like a time value to me, so let's just see what we are getting. So if I go to the weather fields in API response, it will actually explain what all the fields mean. So somewhere around here we have the dt. So it is actually the time of data calculation. Okay, so this is basically when this data was calculated. Okay, so I'm comfortable enough with showing this time on the dashboard, so that's what I'm going to show here. But how do we parse such a time to human readable time? Okay, we need to figure that out. So this is telling me that, yeah, this time is in terms of Unix, or it can be in terms of UTC as well, and we can change that unit somewhere around here. But I don't want to do that. I can easily use we're going to use a library to actually format this time anyways in this fashion. So I'm gonna introduce that library right now. So this type of time format is called Unix timestamps. Okay, this is basically used through like in low-level systems to store time in terms of in integer format. Okay, so there is a very popular library for handling time, and there are many more libraries similar to this, but this is something that I use, and it's called Moment.js. Okay, so this is the library that I'm talking about. I'll just install it, and there are many things that you can do with it. So you can basically get the current time and then specify what format you want the time to be printed in, and that way you can get the time in any of the formats that you want. You can also set relative formats like you see in social media applications. So these are also supported, and it also supports calendar times like this, and multiple different locales. So basically somewhere around the world you have time in a particular format, so you can do that as well. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use. So I'll just install it now. I'll paste the command that I copied, yarn add moment, and hit enter. Once we install it, we can use it, and the way we use it is by importing it. And this is a default import. I know this because I've used it a bunch of times. You can also see this from the docs here. So if you go into the docs and you scroll down a bit to the parse section, you'll see how you can use it actually. So first of all, you import it and then you specify it a time. For the current time, you don't need to send any parameter inside the function. But if you want to format some other time, then you can give it a parameter in terms of string or any other format that you wish to give it. We want to give Unix timestamp, right? So we give it a Unix timestamp by just passing that whole thing, like the Unix timestamp value in to this moment function. So that's what I'm gonna do. So I'll scroll down to that particular section over here, and instead of showing 5:36 p.m., I'll write a bit of JavaScript here, which is moment, and in here I'll write data dot main, again optionally chaining it, dot main dot, what's the data that we want to show? It's dt. So it's not data dot main, it's data dot dt. Okay, and then we need to format it, and the format that I want is, first I want to show hours colon, and then the minutes, and they should be small. This should also be small actually, because capital M actually stands for months. And then we can do AM PM, and we can see how we specify all these different formats in somewhere around here. So like if you look at any of the sections over here, let's see, do we have formats? Yeah. So for hours you have HH, for minutes you have MM, and for AM PM you'll have, does it show somewhere? Let's just search for it. Okay, so for AM PM, you can use small a or capital A, whichever you want. So I'll use A here and hit save. So with just this, you'll get the actual time when this data was taken, like when this data was recorded in the OpenWeather API's system. Okay. So now we can remove this time, like the hard-coded time, and we'll get that particular time into our application. Similarly, I'll also get the week, the day of the week. So the way we get the day of the week is, again, there must be some like format for it, and what the thing that we are like the data that we want to format is again the same, but this time we are changing this part. Okay. And one thing that I would like to mention is that when we are formatting Unix timestamp, Moment expects that this value is in milliseconds. Okay. So this should be a really big value like this. But the value that we are getting here is if we go into the DT field, it was somewhere around here, right? Yeah, so if we go into the DT field, it's not actually showing us any value, but by just looking at it, I can say that this is in seconds and not milliseconds. So I need to multiply this thing by 1000. Okay. And once I do that, and similarly, I'll multiply it by 1000 over here, and then format it into a particular fashion. So the formats I can also look at the homepage of this like library. So in here, you can see that you can write DDDD to show the whole weekday. Save. And you'll see the exact time when this was recorded. So the latest data was recorded at 8:22 p.m. actually, and it was recorded on Wednesday, that is today. So if I refresh this, you'll see that the latest data was now recorded at 8:31 p.m. Okay, so this is also done. Let's move on to the next part, and we can get this data from, I guess, somewhere. Let's just see where we can get the data from. So we can get it from weather, and weather is an array. So we can get it from the first element of that array because we are getting the current weather. So it will always have the length 1. So inside the array, inside the first element, we have the description that is mist or whatever is the current status of the weather. So this is what I want to show. So I'll do data dot weather dot, and weather is an array. It's always an array. So I'll do I need to check if this is actually an array. And for arrays, we don't have any kind of optional chaining or anything. So what we can do is we can write a condition for this. So in order to check if something is an array or not, we can use array dot is array. Okay. So I'll put this whole thing inside here, and it will basically tell me if this thing data.weather is an array or not. Okay. And when it is an array, then conditionally I want to render this thing data.weather square brackets the first element. Okay. So this is the first element, and from inside the first element I want to show the description. So I'll write description and hit save. So this will give me the description here, but it is in lowercase. So for that, I can write a simple JavaScript expression or JavaScript property. So that is text transform, and I'll call it capitalize. Now it's in, like, the first letter is in capital. Okay. Moving on to this part. For now, here I'll just show the current, the current location value. So I'll go to the locations. So it is inside location selector, right? And location selector is a child of sidebar, right? It's right around here. So I'll send the same data into location selector as well. Remember that we are getting this data, or we are getting this particular state inside our app, right? Then we are renaming it to data. Like, we are basically setting the data prop to this state. So now this data inside the sidebar refers to that particular state in application in app.js. And then we are also sending this data again into location selector. Now I can obviously rename this over here as well, but for now I'm just sending this data to location selector. And in here I can extract that data, and I can show that data down here in the this particular div. So I'll just comment this out, and like, because I'm going to reuse that later on, and here I'll write data dot, let's see where we can get the location from. So it's in here, Chennai, but I also want to show the country that is here in sys dot country, right? So I'll write data dot Chennai, sorry, I mean data dot main, data dot name, and then I can put a comma and put another set of curly braces and write data dot sys dot country. Okay, and this should work. All right, so yeah, it's showing me Chennai, India, and I cannot change this value because obviously this is not showing the preferred locations now. This is showing a static value from the API call. Okay, so it is being changed in the backend, but it is not re-rendering this component because that particular state is not used anywhere. Okay, so if I show this to you, like if I open this up and open this up, like if I click this, this particular thing is not changing over here as well. All right. So I'll just pause for a while. Let's just take a short break here, and like you guys can copy whatever. Like you guys can look and take this down if you want. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. So I'll open app.js as well and location selector as well. All right. So have you guys taken this down?
Yes, we.
Okay. Okay. So let's move on. So we got a simple, API. We sent a simple API call through, and we got all this data. We can also change all of this over here, but I will leave this up to you because all the data that you need to show on this whole page is already present here, except for this air quality. Because if we try to search through this whole thing and see where we are getting air quality, you'll see that it's nowhere to be found. Okay, so I've already explored this API a bit, so I know that it's nowhere to be found. So what we can do is we need to do is we need to write another API call that will actually get us this air quality as well. Okay, so once we have the location with us, we need to make another API call for getting the air quality, and we know this by getting into the API that there is a different API for getting the air quality as well. So it's somewhere around here. I can simply search for air pollution. So yeah, it's the air pollution API. Let's just get into its API documentation. So there is the current air pollution data. So it's also explaining you the concept behind how air quality is measured. So there is a quantitative name and also an index related to it, and this index is basically defined based on different ranges for all of these different pollutants in the air. Okay, and their concentration. All right. So let's just see how the API looks. So the current air pollution data, for current air pollution data, we can send this particular API, and it is based off of only longitude and latitude. So it expects you to give a longitude and latitude in order to get the air quality for that particular location. Okay, so we can already see that this is actually dependent on the previous API call, right? Because we don't have the longitude and latitude for Chennai or any other location that the user hits here. Before the user actually sends, before actually the API call is sent, this coordinate is only available after the API call is being sent, right? So it depends on the previous API call. So we need to wait, in order to make this API call, we need to first wait for the first API call to complete, right? And once we get that data, then only we can make the next API call. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. So I'll actually expand this into a curly braces because now I need to write multiple lines in this function. So after I get the response, I'll actually, before setting the weather data, I'll actually do something else. So I'll write another axios.get, okay? And this will also have a then and a catch. So in here also I didn't write a catch, right? So the catch is basically to log any kind of errors, to basically handle any kind of errors. So for now I'll just log it to the console. Any kind of error happens, I'll be able to see it in the console. And so, and similarly I'll do the same thing here. So I'll log this to the console. Okay, and I'll write I'll edit the get and then functions later on. So let's just first open Postman and see what we are getting from the API. Okay, let's open a new tab and put this in. And for latitude, I'll enter whatever was being returned from here. So I'll write this. And for longitude as well, I'll enter whatever was being returned from here. Now paste it. And in the API key also, I'll paste what we used earlier. I'll paste it and hit send. So for this particular latitude and longitude, I'm getting a list. So let's just see what the list has. So the list only has one element. So I think because we sent only I think it is a list because of maybe some other options that we can send to this. So yeah, because we are only focused on the current air pollution data. But if I want the forecast for air pollution data, like multiple different forecasts, or I want a historical chart, then in that case I can define for what times I want that, and it will return me a list of all the different data points that were recorded for different timestamps. Okay, so but we are not interested in that. That is why we are only getting one item in this list. And this item contains, first thing is the air quality index, which is 4, and then it contains the concentration of each of the pollutants in the atmosphere. But I'm only I'm only focusing on the air quality index for now. Okay, and from the documentation itself, we also know that there is a qualitative name for each of these indexes, right? So the weather quality for Chennai is open weather is saying that it's very poor, and I mean, yeah, that's obvious. But okay, so we are going to use this text as well in our application, and that's what we are going to show in the air quality here. Okay, so I'll copy this whole thing and I'll paste it inside the get here. Okay, but you can already see that this latitude and longitude needs to be needs to be extracted from the earlier call, right? So it must be extracted from this response, right? So that's what I'm going to do now. So actually I'll first rename this to something smaller, so I'll call it res, and then I somehow need to put that value over here. Okay, so one way can obviously be to define separate strings like this, and then put add in between and another add, and then put our variables in between like this. What was the value name? It was coord, right? So hold on. Yeah, so it was coord. And similarly dot lat, and similarly here as well, in our 2 plus, and res dot coord dot long, right? These are the names here. Okay, so one way is to do it like this, but this breaks the whole code into multiple different sections and breaks the whole string, and it looks really ugly to me. Okay, so JavaScript actually offers us a way to do this in a cleaner way, and that is by using string literals or template literals. Okay, So the way you do it is you define a string using not the quotes or not the double quotes or the single quotes, but by using the backtick symbol that is present above the tab button on your keyboard. Okay, so I put a backticks at the start and a backticks at the end, and this is basically called a string literal. So this is basically like a fill in the blanks statement. Okay, so you can define blanks in here by using a dollar curly braces like this, and then you can fill these blanks with variables of like that you wish to put here. Okay, so in here I need to put res.coord.lat, and in here I need to put res.coord.lon. Okay, and similarly we can also do the same thing for app id as well, everywhere actually. So I'll replace this with my actual app id, so that is res.coord. I'm sorry, not res.coord, it should be process.env dot whatever was the name of that particular environment variable. So I'll just copy it from here. Okay, and I'll paste it here. This time around, you'll see that the syntax highlighting is not working, and that is again because this is not a template a string literal. This is a simple string, right? So I'll just change this, replace this by a backtick, and that will actually change this into a variable now. Okay, so now if I save it, and actually I need to change it over here as well. Copy it and change this app ID to this. Save, and let's see my API key is working or not, and it's still not working. So what I'll actually do is replace this env by the env that Kunal gave me. So now I'll hit save. Okay, and I'll try to hold on, and I'll try to refresh it. So I need to restart the server, obviously. So once I hit the yarn start again, and I refresh this. So why is it not working? Let's see what's the call that is being sent.
I'm getting the same error.
Yeah. So cannot read properties of yeah. So again, it's saying that cannot read properties of undefined, right? So let's see why it's saying that. So we are getting a complete response from here, and then only we are calling this API, right? So okay, and are we logging the lat and long anywhere? Yes. So in line number 33. This should not actually happen because like we are doing this in the then call, right? After we are actually getting the response. So inside here we are doing res.coord.lat and
It should be
res.coord.lat.
available over there.
Sorry, what?
Like it should be available over there.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just see by console logging it if we are getting that res or not. Okay, yeah, so I figured out what the issue was. So we don't want actually this coord would
Yeah,
not be
dot
present.
data. Right.
Yeah,
Dot data.
it should be res.data because the res is actually the whole access response, but we are only focusing on its data, right? So that's what it should be. It should be res.data.coord.lat and then res.data.coord.lon for
Yep.
longitude.
Working.
Yeah, and then if I hit save, so you'll see that this data is being available, and now I need to do something with that data. So I'll call it AQ data, or let's call it air data, and let's first console log it. Okay, air data. So this is what we are getting from the air data, and inside here we are getting that list that we saw in Postman, right? And in the list we are getting everything from the AQI index to the component concentrations as well. All right, so now what I want to do is, and like what I'm being lazy here, so like what I want to do is that I want to combine the data that I got from the original API and from this API into a single state, that is the weather data, right? So instead of setting the weather data over here, instead of doing that, what I can do is I'll actually set the weather data when both of these APIs have successfully executed. Okay, so that will happen not inside this then block, but inside this then block. This is the then block that will fire after we get the weather data as well, right? So in here, what I'll do, I'm sorry, I meant air data. Okay, so I'll name this I'll rename this to weather data. Okay, and now it's not being used anywhere. Actually, it wasn't being used earlier as well. Let's see if it is being used or not. Okay, so yeah, it's being used here. So I'll just rename this. I'll call it weather data. Okay, and here it's called air data, right? So I want to combine both of these data into a single object. Okay, so the way I'll do it is I'll put the air data inside the weather data. Okay, so first of all, I'll extract it. So const weather equals to weather data dot data, because this is like, remember, this is the Axios response, right? And this data is the actual body that we are getting from the API. So this is weather. Now inside this weather, I'll add a new key. I'll call it air equals to, and I'll add all the air data inside it. So it should be air data dot data. I hope this is making sense. Like, I'll just console log this and I'll show this to you. So I'll console log the whole weather now. Okay. Let's see what we are getting. Once I hit refresh, I'll get everything that I was getting earlier, but also a new property over here, that is the air. And inside there, I'm getting the whole list, right? This whole thing. So now I've basically combined all the data into a single variable, and now I can call set weather data over here. Okay. So you can already see that this is becoming very complex, right? Like we are basically chaining multiple different promises into like different then and catch blocks. And if you're using like 3 or 4 different API calls to get all of your data regarding to your a certain feature or a certain component, then in that case this is becoming very complex. So there is something called async await that you can use instead of using chaining these different get then and catch blocks to avoid this scenario, which is basically called callback hell. So you're basically providing callbacks for when a certain promise is succeeded or fails, and that makes a lot of clutter, and this code looks really ugly. So to replace this, we have something called async await that we can use to avoid this scenario. Okay, so the way we use async await is so we basically or actually like this would work for now because there are only 2 parts here, but we can replace this by async await. So like if you want, like we can discuss async await right now. It's up to you guys. Do you want to do it? Like, do you want to know about async await right now?
Yes, bro, sure.
Okay, all right. So okay, so the way we do async await in use effect is, so it's a little different from how we do it in in case of like normal functions. But since use effect is a special hook, right? So we can't define. So basically, to use async await, we define a function to be an async function like this. But when we do it in case of use effect, it will say that effect callbacks are synchronous to prevent race condition, and we can't put async like this. And it will also tell us that how we can actually put async. So it's telling us that we need to define an async function inside use effect, and then we need to call it. So that way async can be used inside use effect, and React is generous enough to have this in their documentation. They already predicted that some guy is going to do this, so that is why they had this in their documentation. So here I'll define a function which would be an async function. So we'll do const async, sorry, async. Wait,
Like
not
replacing
like
the
this.
graph
I'll,
data.
I'll yeah. I'll write get weather data equals to, and this should be a arrow function, but not a normal arrow function. This should be an async arrow function. Okay. So inside here, I'll write my actual, code to get the data. So now in async, what we can do is, instead of specifying then and all, what we can do is we can wait for this promise to succeed. So we can say that I need to await for this particular promise, this access.get promise to actually succeed, okay? And then only we want to move further, okay? So in here, we are actually waiting for this response to complete, and then only it will move to the next response. Because anyways, we are going to work with this response only when this first response is completed, right? That is why we can write this, and we can wait for the response over here, okay? So then whatever response I'm getting, I can store it in some variable. So I'll call it weather res equals to this thing, okay? And then I'll call the, once this completes, then I'll call the next one. So it's air res, or okay, yeah, air res equals to, and I'll copy this particular API call now. Then what I can do is, so inside here, instead of weather data, it should be now weather rest. So I'll just copy paste it. Okay. And now what will happen is, here also I'll wait for it. And once we have both the data, so we waited for this data to come through, then we waited for this data to come through. So once we, so down here, we'll have both of those data completely, succeeded, and both of those data in these variables. Okay. So now we can combine them, and we can set it into a state. Okay. So now I can just paste these three values here, and instead of air data, I need to use air res, and instead of weather data, I need to use weather res. Okay, and I can safely delete this now. Okay, so you can see that like nested callback hell is now replaced with a simple linear code that can be read easily. So it's waiting for a particular API request, then it's waiting for another request. Kunal, can you mute your mic? I'm having some background
Yes,
noise.
sure.
Okay. So then I'm combining both of those data and setting it into the state, right? So what about catching errors? How would you catch errors in this scenario in when you're using async await? So what you do is you wrap this whole thing inside a try catch block, or you can wrap specific areas where you think that the code might fail in try catch blocks. I'll actually wrap this whole thing in a single try catch. So we are trying to run this code, and if something happens, if something goes wrong, we are instructing JavaScript to catch that error. And when it's catching it, we are instructing it to do something with that error. So we are console logging it. Instead of console logging it, we can show it on the screen as a pop-up or something, but we are just console logging it for now. Okay. So this is much simpler. So now I can just call this whole function that I defined right here, down here, as React told us to do. And now we are getting all of the data properly. Okay. If I refresh, nothing has changed. We are getting all the data, but this time we are also getting the air quality index. I mean, air quality here. Okay. Now I can plug that into the particular stat card. Okay. So here you see we were getting the index value. I'll first extract the data prop from here, and we were sending the index value like this, right? So now we can send it like this. I'll write dot air dot, so inside air we have this list, and so dot list. And this time around, what will happen is we'll either have the whole air data, or this whole thing would be undefined, right? Either air would be undefined, or if it is defined, then we'll have that list. We know that for sure, that because we'll actually have the whole response, right? So this list would definitely be there. So we don't need to test if it is an array or not. I'll just write 0, and then inside there I'll get the main dot aqi, right? So dot main dot aqi. I know this is a bit like complex because there's a lot of nesting here, but you can break it down step by step by going to each of these properties, and then seeing what's next, what comes next, and so on. So if I hit save, you'll see the air quality is now updated to 4 as it's shown here, right? Next thing, so based on what index we are sending, we need to show a like text down at the bottom, right? So I'll actually define these texts inside the air quality itself. So out here I'll write status strings. Okay. I'll start it with a small case. Okay. This would be an object. I want this to be an object, and this object would have its key as an index. Okay. So what all index do we support? these are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for each of these indexes, we'll have a particular string. Okay. All right. So inside the string, I'll just copy paste what I want to show. So here it should be fair, and then moderate, and poor, and finally very poor. Okay. So then we can use it over here. So the way we do it is by writing status strings dot so there are 1 2 3 4 5, right? So I can't write index value over here because index value is not the property name in this JSON, right? The property names are 1 2 3 4 and 5. So how do we refer to them? So we can do it in a similar way we do in arrays, but inside the square brackets, we'll not write the index this time around because index are not defined in case of status, right? We'll actually write the variable name that is a property. This is not index value. This is actually the property name for this like that are available in this JSON object. Okay, so if index value is ranging from 1 to 5, then in that case this would actually give us a text, and if it's not, then it will not give us an error. It will give us undefined. Okay, which is fine by me. But if we were using we could have used arrays for this as well. But in that case, if we are sending any invalid data to index value, in that case it would give us an error, like the whole application will error out. So that is why I used JSON here. Okay, so if I go back here, I'll see that the correct text is also being shown. So you can send the data to each of these components one by one on your own and see like how they update whenever you refresh it. So like earlier this was 28.32, now it's 3.1, and like you just try to make this whole thing dynamic on your own. Okay, so this is how we write simple API calls and all. I was hoping to start with Redux as well today, but since we are already ahead of time, so we're gonna do that tomorrow, from tomorrow onwards. So for now, like you can like I'll just introduce a little bit of the need for Redux here in our application. So the first need that arises is that by the digging that I'm doing here. So the data originates from app, right? That's where we are getting all the data, but then we are digging it down to all of the components. Like we are sending it to stats using this particular prop here. Then inside stats, we are also sending the part of the data to air quality. And when you guys implement this, you'll be also sending it to each of these components as well, right? So this is something that's called prop digging. So you're sending it at like down at multiple different levels. So this is the first place where global state management can help, because you can extract whatever state value or state variable you want at the exact location where you want them. Okay, so that's the first need that Redux satisfies. Okay, the second thing is when we are actually changing these locations, in that case we want that the whole thing re-renders at places where it needs to re-render. Okay, but if we are doing that using set weather data, then that would happen like this would what would this would do is re-render the whole app component as well. But the whole application like re-rendering the whole application is not recommended, because if your application is very complex and it has like thousands of components, in that case it will take a long it would take a very long time to re-render. Not long for us, but in terms of CPU time, it would take a very long time. So that is why changing data in application JS is like very frequently is not recommended. Well, once or twice is fine, but changing it very frequently is not something that you should do. So that is why we're gonna use Redux to store the weather data as a global state, not as a component state like we are doing here, but as a global state value, and then we can extract it from anywhere. So we're gonna get into Redux tomorrow, and we'll also try to implement this search feature by using the geocoding API. I guess that was the name for it. So I'll just search it, geo something. let's see what it was. Yeah, so using the geocoding API. So what this API does is it will basically, there are two types of geocoding. There's a direct geocoding, so it converts basically coordinates, like it gives you coordinates from location name, and there's a reverse geocoding. So by postcode or zip code, it will actually give you the coordinates. Okay, so we're going to use this one because usually people search by location names, right? So we'll by typing in any kind of location name, we'll try to show a list of like responses that we want to show. So if I actually use this right now, like if I show you this response over here, okay, I'll remove this whole part and I'll paste it, and this will be the API key. And instead of London, I'll just write CHP, okay, for Chennai. So I'll assume that this is what the user starts typing. And the limit is 5, so it will actually give me 5 responses, but I can change it. So I'll just change it to 8, and I'll send this. So I'm getting two different, like two different responses over here. The first one is in LA, and the second one is in NG. Okay, I don't know what this stands for, but yeah. So these are the different country names that I'm getting. I'm not getting Chennai for some reason, so I'll just search for CHEN or CHENN. So as I start doing this, okay, it's not working for some reason, but we'll try to figure this out later on. But this is the API that basically returns us the list of all the different places that are present all around the world, and from there we can get the location, longitude and latitude, which will then be used in calling these APIs over here. Okay, so it's going to get a little more complex than what we have in place right now, but let's figure this out later on. So that's it for today's session. If you guys now have any questions, you can ask me. Or if you don't have any questions, you're free to leave.